Got enough to go on there?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
Support for Trifles comes from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon and Substack. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/trifles and at trifles.substack.com. And now you can enjoy some Trifles swag, mugs, notepads, and oval stickers, available in our store. Find it at ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the problem was final, the house was empty, and his bow was last, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Why would the Pope engage Sherlock Holmes' services? Why did he receive the Legion of Honor from France? And why would he refuse a knighthood?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 489, Watson's Embellishments. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you ready for some ornamentation, some adornment, some embroidery, some enhancement, some filigrees and doodads, appliques, and flourishes?
You know, it's funny you should mention that. Yeah, I am. I have been having the strangest dreams lately.
Uh-oh.
And, I was thinking that I was leading a great nation, and I woke up, and the first thing I thought about was covering my nose in gold foil.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
And then I
went on, to my right ear and my left ear, and I think I'm onto something here.
Well, you're in good company.
Yeah.
Well, we are going to be talking about embellishments. It is thanks to the intrepid interests of our listeners that we go on in this style. One of our listeners wrote in, JC. I don't have any information other than that. The email is WC's Boat, and the note was signed JC, which I found interesting. But JC said, Holmes states in the Copper Beeches that Watson has been embellishing his stories. And he went on to wonder if it's possible that Watson was not only exaggerating the stories for dramatic effect, for emotional framework and whatnot, but simply to make them more exciting. And does this affect our view of Watson as a reliable narrator? Well, let's dig into this as our topic today, and we'll do that right after this quick word. I wanted to remind you that if you'd like to support the show, you can do that in a number of ways. You can do it on Patreon. You can do it on Substack. Both have options for either annual subscriptions, or if you just want to go a month at a time, that's more than welcome. Whatever suits your pocketbook and your time frame, we're more than happy to have you aboard as a subscriber, as a supporter. And when you do that, what that allows you to do is to access all of the archives of the show and listen to us ad-free. We even have some bonus content that we release from time to time, such as our Trifling Trifles episodes, where we take just about 5 minutes or so and get into something very quick. So if that is something that meets with your approval and you'd like to try, go right ahead. And if you'd rather just support us with a one-time purchase, well, we have Trifles merch available. We have Trifles mugs. We have Trifles notepads. We have a link in the show notes to ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise where you can get all of that and more. So check that out and support your favorite show. And Trifles, too, for that matter. So JC has us wondering about Watson's embellishments. And, I think this is a good thought piece because it's going to allow us to delve not only into some of the stories, but perhaps to make some suppositions ourselves along the way, whether we think Watson was stretching the truth and where he might have done so in a way that's been in service to the stories and in some ways that maybe harmed them. So what's your gut reaction to all of this, Bert?
Oh, my gut reaction is I shouldn't be eating Chinese food so late in the evening. But other than that...
More probiotics, please.
Well, I actually have had a lot of luck with amateur biotics.
That's what we serve at the amateur mendicants meetings.
Oh, yeah. But the problem is that the cocktails are never the same way twice. You should write down some of these recipes, that's all. Well, I think it's a terrific topic because, it called to mind. I didn't have really a gut reaction to it, but it called to mind the fact that at the heart of the Sherlock Holmes and Watson relationship, there is, I guess it's not too much of a stretch to say, it sort of is all really about, in one way or another, conflict. And that is, Holmes is a remarkable, perceptive individual who's interested in observing and recording and concluding, taking facts about the life and the world around him and using that to uncover what's really going on, does sort of stand in conflict with a personality who is presented to us as a sort of a friendless, isolated military man coping with post-traumatic stress disorder, and whom we are surprised to find, as the reading public is surprised to find, has considerable literary skill. That apparently is one of these things that, never cropped up in his upbringing. I mean, we know he's an avid reader, Watson is. We know what he reads, mostly popular things. We know a lot about his interests. In fact, you could say we learn more about Watson than we learn about Holmes as the cases progress. But it's these two personalities, that are put together. And what happens here is that the one, Watson, the less well-defined, not as quick, not as observant, not as world-aware, is tasked with reporting the results and actions and surprises of this remarkable individual. And a less talented person, Watson turns out to be a very talented writer. Less talented writer, far from just presenting the facts in any sort of a way, would have done a really bad job of it. So it's, it's interesting. And this is sort of the back end of that, which is Holmes observing Watson in action, if you will. Basically saying, you describe it and you've interpreted and you've seen it and you've described it and you're telling other people about it in a way that's very alien to me. And that's interesting. It is sort of and it's sort of a constant theme. I mean, as it goes on over these decades of these two people working together.
Yeah, and when you think about it, what's set up from the get-go is I don't necessarily want to say it's a conflict, but at least the dichotomy of the scientific reasoner and the heroic romantic that we have in Holmes and Watson. And of course, Watson is literally able to get the last word because he is the storyteller. And from the get-go, we have this differing view of the way Holmes's cases should be presented to the public. And this comes to us in the second Sherlock Holmes story that was ever published. So remember, A Study in Scarlet made its way to the public in 1887 in Beeton's Christmas Annual. And then the second publication was in Lippincott's magazine, The Sign of Four, 3 years later. And you have this really wonderful kind of in-reference, in-universe reference, where Holmes and Watson are in their sitting room, and Holmes is remarking on having read A Study in Scarlet. And Watson says, I've embodied it in a small brochure with the somewhat fantastic title of A Study in Scarlet. And then Holmes shook his head and said, I glanced over it, and honestly, I cannot congratulate you upon it. Detection is or ought to be an exact science and should be treated the same in the same cold and unemotional manner. You've attempted to tinge it with romanticism, which produces much the same effect as if you worked a love story and elopement into the fifth proposition of Euclid. And Watson protests. He said, well, the romance was there. I could not tamper with the facts. And here's the interesting part. So right there, we've got Watson saying he's truthful about the narrative. And then Holmes says some facts should be suppressed, or at least just a sense of proportion should be observed in treating them. And he goes on to say that he only thought the analytical reasoning portion of that story was what deserved to be told. But I thought it was interesting there that Holmes, he sets the tone for the rest of the canon, that he doesn't appreciate Watson's romanticism, and yet at the same time he tells him to leave out some facts.
Yeah. But isn't it interesting? I'm so glad you pointed that out. Isn't it interesting that over all the things that we've read and discussed, I don't know that anyone has ever pointed out this, which is that it just sort of occurred to me as I was thinking about what you were saying as you were saying it. So Holmes does, in fact, early on, first case, turn to Watson and he basically uses the phrase, doesn't he? You have attempted to, right? Aren't those his words?
Yes.
You've attempted to.
Yeah.
Now, think about that for a second. If you, and I were involved in, anything. I mean, went to a bookshop or met some friends or had a good meal. And you walked away with one idea of what had happened, and I walked away with something very different. Which is really what's happened here. Holmes has just gone through this case, and Watson has written it up, and Holmes basically says, you have attempted to do something here with this. That it's rather, why would he have not said, is that really how this impressed you? Is that all you? I mean, he didn't take it as a reasonable interpretation of the event. He didn't take it as, another point of view. Not that. It was, he sort of impresses a motivation on it. Now, in fact, of course, it is appearing in a popular magazine and it's a story. But he's not just saying, you tried to turn this into a story. Well, yes, Holmes, but that's what they publish here. I mean, he didn't say that. He didn't say, you're treating me as a character. He didn't say that. He didn't say, he didn't make I just find that very interesting because if you look at, there's this question of Watson's embellishments, and you stay with Scandal in Bohemia, you stay with Study in Scarlet, what you find is this very early observation by Watson. I think it's the first one of Watson's writings about an actual location of a case. So Watson says, Number 3, Lauriston Gardens wore an ill-omened and minatory look. And then he goes on and he says, it looked out with 3 tiers of vacant melancholy windows, which were blank and dreary, save that here and there a to let sign had developed like a cataract upon the bleared panes. Well, now.
That's beautiful, actually.
It's gorgeous.
I've never paid attention to that, but
yeah. This writer has a certain sense of word usage and word painting, and chooses words very carefully and arrange. I mean, it's
What this is.
And why would have Holmes not said it did not so impress me?
Right. Well, he was viewing these cases, and I think he tells us later on in the Abbey Grange. He said, your fatal habit of looking at everything from the point of view of a story instead of a scientific exercise has ruined what might have been an instructive and even classical series of demonstrations. You slur over the work of the utmost finesse and delicacy in order to dwell on the sensational details which may excite but cannot possibly instruct the reader. And, as you were reading that description of the approach to number 3 Lauriston Gardens, I thought, well, if Sherlock Holmes were writing this up, he would just say, we pulled up to an abandoned house and went inside. And that was it. But Watson, as the storyteller, has to do more than just present the facts. He needs to present the facts in such a way that engages the reader and puts someone in the cab next to Holmes and Watson as if they were pulling up to the abandoned house with Holmes and Watson. An active participant in the process.
Yeah, I know. I think you're right. But also, if Holmes were doing this, and that's, I suppose, one of the challenges of those few cases that are supposedly written by Holmes himself. If Holmes was writing this, he would, in as I see it, he would have said, we arrived at a house that was, and he would have some description of where it sat on the block and how many houses were around it and how wide the street was. And he would say, and basically what he would be saying is, and maybe he would put this into words, he would say, it was clearly a house not surrounded, not in an active neighborhood, without any close dwelling neighbors, such that anything could really go on and not be observed for a long while. Further, it would be difficult to keep it under regular surveillance, because if there was a regular patrolman, he would have all these observations.
Yeah.
And he would have something to say about the traffic, and then he would have, a glance at the roads and things like that and those kinds of conclusions. So he would be looking at it analytically. He would be analyzing it.
Right.
And but you see, this is I don't know how interesting all this will be to our readers, listeners, because you and I are romantics anyway. Sort of from a 19th century romantic sense, and other people
we appreciate
might find
these,
all this
these
a little,
flourishes, these details, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because there are so many different little scenes we can pull out throughout the canon where this comes up again and again. I think the one, and we can spend a little time on this, the one that really gives us what I think is Watson's irritation with Holmes's irritation is that opening scene from the Copper Beeches, where they're really having it out, and Watson gives us a blow-by-blow of what happens. But before we get to that, I want to also mention that in the cardboard box, which I think, that would have come after the Copper Beeches in publication order, but Watson, in his own defense, says, "In choosing a few typical cases which illustrate the remarkable mental qualities of my friend Sherlock Holmes, I've endeavored as far as possible to select those which presented the minimum of sensationalism while offering a fair field for his talents." So Watson is almost serving Holmes's need, not only his Boswell, but selecting the right cases to bring to the public, because as Holmes said, he wanted them to be a series of classical demonstrations. Watson, in his power of selection, decides not to go too sensational, as to not over-index on Holmes's criticisms, which he tells us in the opening of his story about a double murder where ears were cut off and mailed to an unsuspecting victim.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, interesting, too, though, that, he's making a great point of saying, basically what he sort of is refuting is Holmes's criticism to his public in print by saying, no, what I'm doing here is not that at all. I'm not going for sensationalism. In fact, I'm, trying to focus on these really remarkable things Holmes did. Even if, as you say, he will then go on and say, by the way, guess who got this in the mail?
Yeah. Well, I suppose that raises the question as to whether Watson played loose with the facts or was simply embellishing the details for reader interest. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there's a good case to be made for the fact that Watson was playing loose with the facts in a number of areas, particularly those cases that have been particularly difficult for chronologists and people who are concerned about or sensitive to the timeline of the events of the Sherlockian world. Yeah, I think that's really a better way to think about it. What about the timeline of events in the Sherlockian world? I mean, when you look at history, or you look at the work of characters, or you look at the work of a detective like Sherlock Holmes over 40 years, some things happen before other things. You meet Watson before, A Study in Scarlet, because A Study in Scarlet is very clearly the first case. But some of these things, as Watson goes on, and we just got into this in a prior Trifles episode about the timing of one of the cases. Watson will write, well, this was in September of, 1887. And then someone will come along and say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense at all for this reason or that reason. And then, Watson will report that his wife is away at her mother's when clearly he's married someone who has no mother or no relations in England. And clearly Watson himself will report his wife calling him by a name other than his Christian name. So, there's a huge case to be made about Watson as being untrustworthy with the facts.
Mm. Well, about that knockdown, drag out spat they had with each other in the opening of the Copper Beeches. We won't read the entire thing. It's worth going back to that story and reading that opening scene, because it's just, particularly with this episode in mind, because it's just so instructive about how they dealt with each other. Holmes accusing Watson, he said, I'm looking at these little records of our cases, which you've been good enough to draw up, and I'm bound to say, occasionally embellish. You've given prominence, not to the cause celebs of sensational trials, but rather to those incidents which may have been trivial in themselves, which have given room for those faculties of deduction and logical synthesis, which I have made my special province. You have erred, perhaps, in attempting to put color and life into each of your statements, instead of confining yourself to the task of placing upon record that severe reasoning from cause to effect, which is really the only notable feature about the thing. And then later on, Holmes reflects a little bit and says, you can hardly be open to a charge of sensationalism, for out of these cases, which you've been so kind to interest yourself in, a fair proportion do not treat crime, in its legal sense at least. A small matter, and he goes down and mentions Scandal in Bohemia, a case of identity, Man with a Twisted Lip, Noble Bachelor. All were matters which are outside the pale of the law. But in avoiding the sensational, I fear that you may have bordered on the trivial. So Holmes wanted the big issues captured in his chronicles.
Yeah, well, that's very fairly put, and I really can't quarrel with anything Holmes says, because he does put it very carefully, and then he does seem to backpedal a little bit about this sensationalism. And he certainly has respect for what Watson's done, and he certainly values highly his participation, his presence, his active engagement, his loyalty.
Oh. Well, you have to remember that this, of course, like the opening to the cardboard box, where Watson claims to avoid the sensational, talks about cut off ears. In this case, we have Holmes bemoaning the fact that he's touched bottom because he, where did he say his, the days of the great cases are past. He said, man, or at least criminal man, has lost all enterprise, and my own little practice seems to be degenerating into an agency for recovering lost lead pencils and giving advice to young ladies from boarding schools.
Oh, poor Violet Hunter.
But we can see how he's concerned with, Watson sensationalizing the trivial when he gets a case like this handed to him. Little did he know, however, what was in store at the Copper Beeches.
Yeah. Little did he know. Well, interestingly enough, Copper Beeches is a case that isn't necessarily involved in any crime, although, we certainly consider that what happened to Violet Hunter to be a crime, and that left unchecked, a worse end could have come to her. But that was a case really of twisted greed and imprisonment and for all sorts of things that are obviously criminal or right on the edge of criminality.
Well, so you embellish.
Yeah, so you embellish. Interesting. How sad, though, that when Holmes did come to write a case, he didn't have an opportunity to really present it in the manner in which he would lead you to think he would based on his prior statements. But instead attempted unsuccessfully, apparently, to emulate the doctor's approach.
And those are just trifles.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Why do you not write them yourself?
I will, my dear Watson, I will. In my declining years,